Welcome to Dialogue This Week. In this corner, we invite guests from in and out of Korea to talk about a wide variety of issues ranging from culture and sports to the latest trends around the world. Now, this week, we will talk about a topic that needs the attention of every single one of us. A topic we face every day, but sometimes tend to forget about its importance. Today, we will talk about ways to stop climate change, possibly stop climate change and preserve our environment, especially as the 26th UN Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, is set to kick off next week. It's a crucial time for the world to be reminded of the seriousness of the situation and make significant pledges that could make a difference. Now, for more in-depth discussion on this, we are joined by Sophia Kianni, founder and executive director at Climate Cardinals, an international youth-led nonprofit organization working to make the climate movement more accessible to non-English speakers by making the information available in over 100 languages. Hello, Sophia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And also joining us is Justine Holmes, researcher at Solutions for Our Climate, a Korea-based nonprofit organization established in 2016, advocating stronger climate and air policies via Skype. Justine, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here today.
Now, let's start a discussion with Sophia. As much as a global concern climate change is, it can also be a personal mission. You are a climate activist, a young founder and executive director of Climate Cardinals. First, I must ask, what prompted you to take such action?
I was really inspired to become a climate activist and to start my nonprofit Climate Cardinals after visiting Iran, which is my parents' home country. When I went to Iran, I was struck by how horrible air pollution was. I know air pollution is a huge concern in Korea as well. And I also learned that in the Middle East, temperatures were rising more than twice the global average. But what scared me the most was the fact that my relatives knew almost nothing about climate change. And so I decided to start translating climate resources into Farsi to teach my relatives in Iran about climate change, which is what inspired me starting Climate Cardinals, because I think it's critical for non-English speakers to have access to the critical climate resources that they need, but most scientific literature is actually only available in English.
Well, that is certainly very meaningful. But like I've mentioned, Climate Cardinals is an international organization, and those involved in leading the action are mostly young, like you've just said. There must be some advantages, but also some challenges you're facing there that you can share with us?
Definitely. So the average age of a Climate Cardinals or volunteer is only 16 years old, which is pretty young. And so I think one of the biggest issues that we've seen is that sometimes we need to reach out to adults or professional translators for help in translating these resources into different languages, especially as we target the Middle East and Asia. So translating into Farsi, into Korean, into Chinese. And so I think that it's really important to have intergenerational dialogue and work, especially as we are approaching COP.
Okay, now let's also turn over to Justin. What about you? What moved you to become a researcher in climate performance, and what role does Solution for Our Climate play?
Yes, I have been working on climate performance. We just launched the Climate Transparency Report 21, which compares G20 countries on climate performance. It's been a really exciting project to be involved in. Obviously in the run-up to G20 and the COP, really important and exciting work. SFOC has been the Korean partner leading the project this year. On a personal level, my motivation has really become in the last few recent years, becoming a mother, and living in Hong Kong for 4 years, and now in Seoul, where of course there are, as Sophia mentioned, serious air pollution issues. And I just think of these air pollution going into my children's lungs. We have we had in Hong Kong non-pollution days at school where the schools were closed, and I had friends with kids suffering from exacerbated asthma from the air pollution. So all this together really propelled me back into working in the climate space. In terms of the role of SFOC, their vision is one of a fossil-free society, and they work through research, advocacy, and litigation in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. And their most recent research has been around the status of fossil fuel subsidies, the climate performance of South Korea, but also looking at the policies and implementation that is needed beyond the target.
You just also mentioned that you've been living in Korea. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but you would have. Over the recent years, South Korea has become more environmentally conscious. But how do you see the day-to-day habits of people when it comes to climate action and overall environmental awareness?
Yes, I agree. Korea is environmentally conscious. A recent Gallup poll has showed that out of 34 countries, Korea has one of the highest perceptions of climate change in terms of being a threat to humanity. And that has been played out in the recent declarations of climate emergencies in around 226 of the provinces around Korea. And also extreme weather events such as the floods in Seoul last year do have an impact on that awareness. However, I also agree that in terms of individual actions, this doesn't necessarily translate into action, this growing awareness. I think with climate change being a big global issue, it's very difficult for people to know how they should respond at an individual level. And I think here is where we need governments and corporations to really step in to meet the challenge of the climate crisis, which really does require systemic change. I think in South Korea as well, there is a very unique situation where you have government and very few large corporations who have a great influence over the economy and are also responsible for many of the emissions. And I think here is also an opportunity for Korea to move quickly on climate change. And have governments and corporations lead public opinion and drive behavioral change by putting in place incentives for renewable energy, by committing to 100% renewable energy policies, and really leading the way for the Korean public.
Yes, I do agree that, powerful organizations and companies and governments should also step in to bring forth more concrete measures. Sophia, like we've just touched upon, one of the things that Climate Cardinals does is encouraging more environmentally friendly habits beyond borders and regardless of language barriers. But you mentioned shortly about Korea. How is Climate Cardinals' involvement in South Korea?
So one of the things that Climate Cardinals has realized is that I also work with the UN on their youth advisory group on climate change. And so the UN languages are Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. And these languages that account for less than half of the world's speaking population, meaning that the majority of people on our planet are unable to understand these documents and agreements that are being issued by one of the most highest international political bodies. And as you can see, that those languages don't include Korean, but Korean is one of the languages that Climate Cardinals translates into, because we do think that it's critical for all people to be able to access climate resources, especially as we were talking about earlier, being able to access resources about what I can personally do or what you personally can do when it comes to taking climate action. But I do agree that systemic action is the largest thing that we need to be focused on. And I know that South Korea's ruling party has recently agreed to increasing the nationally determined contribution to a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since 2017 levels. But I know that a number of US politicians, including John Kerry and Al Gore, have said that that's not sufficient and it needs to be raised to 50%.
All right. And going back to Justine, an average individual living in South Korea might think we're very environmentally conscious. Our recycling and waste system forces us to rethink about the things we're throwing out. And also, grocery stores and even convenience stores don't just give out plastic bags anymore. But do you think these regulations are enough or even still effective? And what would you want to see changed?
Yes, I mean, I'll answer this on a personal level because it's not something that SFOC works on directly, but I'd heard about South Korea's recycling system before I arrived last year in South Korea. But when I arrived, I really noticed that okay, the recycling system is great, but the volume of recycling that gets put through that system is really huge. From the sort of plastic packaging around deliveries to what you receive from cafes, restaurant chains, and in supermarkets around the groceries. I think that is the sort of recycling is really the last resort. So I think, you know, addressing the waste higher up the chain is very important. So I think, again, it really points towards the sort of large corporations such as the big supermarkets and the delivery companies such as Coupang and food and restaurant chains, convenience stores such as GS25, 7-Eleven, really pledging to go plastic free and taking on board plastic free policies within the next decade.
Mm-hmm. And again, Sophia, as world leaders gather in Glasgow next week for COP26, they will once again make efforts to declare bigger plans to cut emissions. They may also tighten guidelines set in the Paris rulebook. But exactly how do we bridge the gap between world leaders making these pledges and individuals making changes to their daily lives?
Well, I actually co-chaired the Youth for Climate conference in Milan, Italy, just a few weeks ago. And one of the things we did is we created these 4 outcome documents. Young people, over 400 young people from over 100 countries, we all came together and we created these 4 outcome documents with policy proposals for world leaders to adopt. And so I'm going to be going to COP26 next week. And this is one of the documents that we're going to be discussing with environmental ministers. And I think that that is one of the ways that in which we can bridge the gap between young people, between the ordinary citizens, and between our governmental leaders, just so that we are having this dialogue and we're really clearly communicating what is it that we want to see as far as climate action goes, and what can our world leaders do to better represent our concerns.
And Justine, attending the COP26 is part of President Moon Jae-in's 9-day trip to Europe. And last year, the president pledged to go carbon neutral by 2050 and even vowed to raise South Korea's emission reduction goal to 40% of 2018 levels by 2030. Now, that's significantly higher than the previous 26.3%. In order to achieve this goal as a nation, what moves have we made in the right direction, and what changes do we still need to make to ultimately reduce our carbon emissions?
Yes, you're right. The ambition has been raised in the most recent target that's been put forward by the South Korean government. Unfortunately, as was previously mentioned, it's not quite enough to be aligned with the 1.5-degree pathway that's required. And it should be around 59% below 2017 levels by 2030 in order to achieve a 1.5-degree pathway by 2030. So I think really the key moment for South Korea is going to be following COP, where the ambition needs to be translated into real policies and action on the ground. For SFOC, this means, and many groups in South Korea, this also means moving forward with a full decarbonisation of the energy sector, which cuts across the power, industry and transport sectors. And specifically, this means more aggressively reducing and phasing out coal. South Korea has, of course, committed to stop the financing of coal overseas, but domestically, it's continuing with building 4 units in South Korea, which will make it very difficult for South Korea to meet its current climate targets. COP is the COP that's going to consign coal to history, so we would like to see South Korea be among those international partners who are pushing for coal phase out that aligns with the holding temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And I think some of the provinces in Korea have already joined the Powering Past Coal Alliance, for example. South Korea could be one of the first national Asian members of that alliance to really show leadership on this issue. Some other key actions on the path towards 2050 carbon neutrality would be phasing out fossil fuel subsidies for coal, oil and gas, and also moving towards the implementation of key policies in the energy sector. I think that Koreans, may experience some short-term inconvenience in terms of electricity price increase. But I think that would be embraced by the Korean public if they could see the benefits of moving to a low carbon future, of the inflow of investment, of the increased quality of life, health and environmental quality of life. I think that could be a real benefit for the Korean public, and perhaps it could even be the next Korean wave.
I also hope so too, for us to reach our goal through the combined efforts. Now, thank you. I'm afraid we will have to wrap up our discussion at this point. Thank you so much, Sophia and Justine, for your insights. Hope to speak to you again soon.
Bye. Thank you.